Welcome to the Claims Hero podcast. Today I'm joined by Mahoney, who is my business partner, and we're going to be talking all things mould claims.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Luke. I do feel like you messed up the intro, though. I was meant to be business partner and best friend. Look at the smile on his face.
All right. Well, we're talking everything about mould claims. As you're well aware, there is no such thing as a mould claim. Most insurance policies, particularly domestic insurance policies, do not necessarily cover mould unless it's related to an insured event. The main reason that mould becomes an issue is obviously once you do have an event and water gets into the property, if it's not dealt with, mould does arise at that point. And it's in those circumstances where the mould is related to an event that most insurance policies do cover it. However, we do know that these are very complex, and mould claims are often due to a number of things going wrong in that process. So by the time they come to us, which might be after 6 to 12 months, we do see that they've become significantly complex at that point. It can be extremely stressful for people who are going through it. And it's particularly important because when you have a mould claim, it gets worse over time. So the longer that you leave it, the longer you don't deal with the mould, the bigger the problem becomes, which is unlike a lot of other things that can get damaged, like a broken window, which in 12 months time, it's the same broken window. Particularly important as well because mould can have significant health impacts. And so for people who might be living in properties that are impacted by mould, they can experience a significant number of symptoms. And I feel like the science around the medical aspect of it is continuing to be more and more understood. And that can have a big impact if you are finding yourself stuck in a property that's filled with mould. So today we're going to cover off, I guess, what happens, what leads to these mould claims. And then after that point, if you do find yourself with an insurance claim that involves mould, what you can do about it, what are some of the tips and tricks that we've seen that can try and avoid them dragging on for too long or becoming bigger than they need to be. So with that, Alex, talk to us about, I guess, like how does a mould claim come to be, and what are the things that tend to lead up to that where mould might become a problem in an insurance claim?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said there should be no mould claims and policies don't cover moulds. They're only ever created based on the response to the claim. So they always result from a water-based claim. Under their relevant standards, they require a remediator or expert to go in and dry the property out and cut out any contaminated materials almost immediately, because mould can develop in 24 to 48 hours. Since being in the industry, it's such a surprise to see how often that doesn't occur. I'd almost say most claims. It's a difficult burden for all insurers to get out there by that period of time, but it is required really to minimise and stop that mould.
I think that's right. Like if you think about any claim that involves water, it has the potential to become a mould claim at some point. And it's pretty clear in the science that you have a number of days to start drying out a property or mould is going to develop. And what we do see, as you mentioned, is that you have a very clear water ingress event, might be a storm, cyclone, burst pipe, and the customer does the right thing. They call the insurer. The insurer comes out. Customer then just trusts the insurer, thinking that their contractor is going to do the right thing. And as you mentioned, for a variety of reasons that we'll get into, it does seem like it's quite common that those actions that could be taken immediately to keep it quite a small, contained claim that just involves some moisture, if you cut the materials out and dry it, it's probably not going to develop mould. That doesn't happen. And then over time, we see that obviously becomes a far bigger issue. So it's really important when these insurers go out that they should be doing a Makesafes, should be trying to stop the water coming in, and then you should be looking to try and dry out the property at that point. As you mentioned, the reality is that's not what happens.
And it's disappointing to see, because often it's because the insurer hasn't decided if they're going to accept the claim or not. So they're going out to assess the damage rather than kind of limit it and do the things they need to do to actually make it a very small and manageable claim, because they're worried this might be a declined claim and it's not our onus or responsibility to fix this. But by doing that, a claim can go from $2,000 to $1 million, right? Because mould does spread. It's unlike any other insurance claim. Fire occurs, the damage is there, and you have the set standard of what you need to do to repair it. It doesn't change necessarily. Whereas a mould claim, it spreads over time. And if that moisture is not removed, it will spread quicker, and it can impact areas that were never actually impacted by the original event.
Yeah, that's right. So I think if we sort of step back, right, and we think that you've had a water claim or a claim that involves water, right? So we've kind of already covered it off: leaking roof, burst pipe, whatever that might be. If we were to talk through like an ideal state of what should happen, so if you find yourself in that situation, do you want to talk through kind of high level what those steps are that we would expect for it to be done properly, what that looks like?
Yeah, so at a high level, and whether this is the insurer or the person who's had the event happen to them. The first thing is stopping the leak or the point of ingress, right? Now that's quite difficult with the roof because people don't know where the water's coming from, and it might be a significant storm that's allowed that to come in and potentially caused additional vulnerabilities. With a leak, it's a little bit easier. You're going to be able to identify where the location is, or at least turn off the water to the property. Secondly, then immediately it's about locating what is wet. For a normal consumer, they don't have access to dryers. They're not going to start cutting out their walls. They should be going around and trying to dry the property, just with towels, things like that, sucking water out if they can, and then lodging that claim immediately. Once the insurer is notified, they really should be trying to get out there for a water claim, particularly a large water claim, within the first 24 hours, because as I mentioned before, microbial growth starts to occur between 24 to 48 hours of a wetting event. When that happens, they should really be sending out someone out there immediately, not to assess the damage, also to do the make safe. So this is someone with the authority to come in, cut out any materials that have been contaminated by what they call condition 3 water. Condition 3 water being those water that have contaminants in it, more likely to create microbial growth, and then implementing dryers to start to dry the property out. You can't dry everything with towels. Unfortunately, water gets stuck in the cavities and things like that. And then finally containing that area, right? Is if it's not dried appropriately or you haven't cut everything out, it's going to cause the mold. The containment will at least keep it in that area and limit that loss. So a consumer should be looking for those key things and asking their insurer for those key things once they've logged that claim.
Yeah, and I think for consumers who find themselves in that situation, it's about documenting it as soon as it happens. And that means taking a lot of photos and a lot of videos, because we do find later on, 6-12 months down the line, there becomes this debate about, was the mold pre-existing? Was it caused by the event? So having those photos and videos straight afterwards is really important, because it helps show that, well, look, prior to this, there was no damage that you could see, and then obviously mold develops over time. We see with that make safe that you speak about, which is arguably in most policies that the insurer will do the make safe. I think for consumers, it's important that they specifically ask for it. So if your roof is leaking, ask the insurer, can you do a make safe on my roof? What happens a lot is they'll say, oh, there's a maintenance issue on your roof, or you're responsible for the roof, and then no one does anything with it, and then it continues to leak over time. And that's what kind of continues to contribute to mold growth. So I think it's important that they really hold the insurer to account and say, I want a TARP, or I want that dealt with. And then who's actually liable to fix that issue can be dealt with at a later stage. But far too often it's this debate that the customer and the insurer is having, and while they're doing that, no one's dealing with the water ingress, and it's just getting worse over time. So being really upfront with the insurer that you want to make safe, you're worried about mold, you don't want it to develop. That information is really good later on if you need to rely on it to show AFCA or someone else that you were trying to do the right thing. You were trying to mitigate your loss, because a lot of it later on becomes about who actually caused the mold.
Yeah, the additional damage. It is tough. And where we kind of see it break down in quite a few spots, right? Probably two of the main ones I can think of now is there's a make safe to stop the water ingress or the leak. That's one make safe. Then there's the restoration make safe to kind of limit the potential creation of mold from that wetting event. Often an insurer will ask, do you want to make safe? And the consumer might be thinking about the roof make safe first, the restoration make safe. They might not be completely clear on what they're asking. They may even say no at that point. So if you do ever get offered it, we'd be suggesting make sure you understand what they're offering. But as well, the consumer should be asking for both make safes to be done.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, because a lot of the time the insurer will just send out a builder. As the first person to have a look at it, I'll send a builder out. And sometimes those builders don't know about mold and they don't know about restoration. So what they should be sending out is a restoration company. A lot of insurers require that a builder goes out first and then they engage a restoration company. I don't think that's ideal, because the time's ticking during that period and delays are occurring. So just for consumers, it's like, if you want to get the gold star, be asking for it from day one. Can you send out a restorer? Can you send out a builder? So that you can get that proper treatment of that area. And I think when we talk about water and contaminated water, a lot of people also think that it's clean water. Like you think, oh, the leaks come from the roof and therefore it's clean water. Well, the reality is it's not, because your roof often isn't clean because there's bird droppings and things on the roof. And then as it travels down through the insulation, naturally you have rodent feces and other things that it picks up. So by the time it might be coming down onto your ceiling or dripping down onto your furniture, it's actually highly contaminated water at that point. And then the standards are really clear that it should be cut out and dried. If I had a dollar off every time I'd seen a builder saying, oh, paint over that stain, it'll be fine. The truth is that that's why mold develops, right? You've got a water source, you've got a food source, which is those contaminants. That's where this all begins from that point. And then if you have it where it's coming down into wall cavities or something else, I mean, it's the perfect environment for mold to grow. So for us, it's like for consumers, you don't want to find yourself 6 to 12 months later where you relied on the insurer, they didn't do it. Now there's a massive problem and the cost of that is blown out, and the insurer might be trying to put that on you at that point to deal with it. So for anyone who finds themselves in that situation, it is a claim that you have to be proactive and you have to work through with the insurer those steps to make sure that it actually happens.
Yeah, I think unfortunately in the insurance process, often if you don't ask, you don't get. And as you said, they've got to ask for these things. If the insurer's doing everything that they should do by the book, they would do it naturally on every claim, but they don't. And if you don't ask, you won't get. I think the other point, and you touched on it with documenting, what's happened, how far the water's gone. No one's going to know what happened better than you if you saw that event. You should kind of, when you're cleaning up initially and lodging that claim, not only take the photos, but understand how far that water has progressed through the property. Because far too often we'll see the insurer will try and do the right thing, send out a restoration specialist, but the restoration specialist is looking at maybe after it has partially dried. They're not going to know how far it's gone, which walls it might have impacted. So if the client's not there or the insured is not there, telling them where it's gone, what they saw, then they may never see that. And then you risk concealed mold, which can spread through the cavities and then cause a much larger claim later on.
Yeah. And I think on that point, a lot of people will have, say a storm happens and they actually see water dripping in their bathroom through their ceiling. And they'll say to the insurer, oh, I've had water dripping through my bathroom. So when their builders and restorers come in, they'll just focus only on the bathroom. And you think if you don't know why it happened, like if you didn't see a tile fly off and it's just one tile and you can see that that's exactly what's causing it, you need to be asking your insurer and the restorer to assess your property. Because if it's a tile roof, for example, we saw this after the cyclone, tile roofs do not handle heavy rain particularly well and they can start to leak. So if you have that sort of claim and you're seeing in one area there's a stain, it's likely that water may have ingressed in other areas of your roof. And if you don't deal with it, the same principle applies, that you don't identify it, the insurer doesn't document it's related to the event, but that could be contributing to mold growth later on. So make sure that both you and the insurer is assessing the entire property, not just the bit where you can see the damage. And I was at a property earlier today, which was a really good example of this, because the paint that they had on was like a thick layer of paint, right? So a lot of water actually has to get into that roof cavity, soak through the insulation, soak through the plasterboard, and then come through that paint to see the actual water ingress that's come into the property and the stain. And it really doesn't happen, but the restorers have thermal imaging machines and things that they can use where you can see where that water has got into the property, or if they get up into the ceiling board, for example, you can see where the stains are on the beams. But to your point, the longer you leave that, the more it dries out, the harder it is to prove later on that water came from an event, which is the key part of a lot of these policies, is to link to the event that let that water into the property.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's important to remember as well that the ceiling cavity is part of your home and it's covered by the policy. Far too often, a restorer or insurance provider might come into the property and they'll just look at where they can see the damage on the ceiling, but they should also be considering the damage in that ceiling cavity to the insulation, to your sarking, to your roof itself, assessing that to understand how it's come in, but also what needs to happen in that area to actually remediate and repair it, because that can also be a source of continued growth throughout the property.
Well, you hear that a bit, right, with some providers, we go, that's a non-habitable area, you don't need to remediate it. And I mean, AFCA determinations have made clear that the insurance policy applies to the whole property, not just the habitable spaces. So if the property burnt down, you don't rebuild everything except for the ceiling voids, so it covers everything. So if it has been contaminated and it's linked to an insured event, you do have to deal with it and you do have to remediate it. And that seems to be a massive misconception among some of the providers in the insurance industry. And it's that misconception at times which then creates environments that allow mold to proliferate through the property. So for consumers, you need to educate yourself. The problem that we see is a lot of people are doing that at 6 to 12 months after a claim, instead of trying to do that at the start, where you might be able to avoid some of the headaches if you are aware of it. I think with the insurer, if they're not listening to you, you need to make a complaint and you need to make your voice heard very quickly, because the longer you leave it, the harder it becomes later on to try and link it to the event.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right, if we had to highlight a few early warning signs that maybe mold might be a problem after your claim, so you've had something happen in your property, what are some of those red flags that you might be looking out for to maybe make you think, okay, there might be a mold problem going on here?
If the work that they're doing doesn't align with what we said. Those immediate steps that they should be doing to try and mitigate the loss and dry it out, those types of things. I think then secondly, if you're noting that materials are still wet or materials that have been visibly damaged by this contaminated water are still sitting there, it's likely that they will ultimately create molds. Properties often start to get a bit of an odor. Everyone's kind of smelt it before. They might get a wet car, right?
Yeah.
Or you leave it overnight and then you start to get that smell. You start to smell that smell. That's a real clear indicator. And obviously the fourth one being visible mold. If visible mold's coming, it essentially validates that the steps taken to date haven't been effective. So you should be raising that with your insurer and asking what they're going to do to try and now, not just mitigate it now, but remove that mold and avoid it from spreading further.
And I think that's the point. Like prior to this, I always just thought it was visible mold was the only thing, right? But what we know is that there's airborne mold. So if you can see the mold, that obviously means that it's been growing for a period of time, right? Obviously it can come up quite quickly, to be fair. But you can also have that airborne mold, right? So particularly when you've been out of your home and you come back in and you're like, that smells a bit moldy, it means that should really be a red flag that you need to act quite quickly. It probably means that something isn't dried out, to your point. I do think that, moisture meters and stuff, you can get them from Bunnings, you can get them from Amazon. They're pretty cheap. So if you are concerned about it, it might be an option that you try to look to get one of those just to validate what is happening. Because if the insurer's not listening to your concerns and listening to those issues, and you probably do need to be mindful that the providers that have come out early on have done certain activities. So if you're then raising concerns to them, maybe some of this is related to the fact that they didn't quite do the right thing when they were first called out to the property. So I think consumers taking some of that into their own hands and being proactive in doing the testing or getting someone out to have a look at doing scientific testing around the mold. As soon as these red flags start to arise, you should be doing that, but always documenting and telling the insurer about it, preferably in writing, so that later on, if a dispute arises, you can go back and say, look, I told you that I could smell mold and you didn't do anything about it. Or I told you that that area was still wet and hadn't been dried out. Or I told you that you hadn't cut out that material and it should have been cut out. That's really valuable later on if you need to refer back to it, that you can't put the insurer on notice.
Yeah, that's right. It's really hard, right? Because we know everyone's busy. An insurance claim happens, you don't expect it, you still have to work, you've still got to look after the kids, you still got to see your friends and family. And it is really easy just to kind of sit in the back seat and let the insurance process roll out. And that's probably easier for claims where it's really visible damage. But mold claims and water claims are extremely different. Expending more effort at the beginning, doing what you said about getting a moisture meter from Bunnings, starting to understand it, documenting it in detail, ensuring that every conversation you have verbally with the insurers and followed up with an email to document what you said, confirming what they agreed. Those extra steps now in the early stages of the claim can really save you a lot of time and heartache in 6-12 months when your damage is not in one room, it's now across the property and you're going to take a significant time to repair.
The only other one I thought of around a red flag is that if you have an insurance provider in there and they're saying things like, oh, that's environmental mold, every house has mold in it, oh, that's humidity-based mold, that's not event-related mold. No one can make that judgment just by looking at mold or smelling it. And we'll get into the fact that there's scientific testing and you can actually work out to a certain extent if the mold might be related or it might be environmental. But if someone is making those comments and they haven't done that testing, frankly, they're bullshitting you, and that should be a red flag. They're not taking it seriously, and you should be going back to the insurer and telling them about the fact that you're concerned that provider's not taking it seriously and asking for a different provider to potentially come out. And if they're not doing that, you should be making a complaint and saying, I'm really concerned about this and I need you to take it seriously and I need you to do scientific testing to understand what's going on from a mold perspective.
I love hearing when they say, oh, it's humidity-based mold. And the next question is, well, what creates humidity? Oh, excess moisture. Oh yeah, well, the whole house just flooded. So would that not create the humidity which created the mold? So yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. It's disappointing to still hear it so often. The reference to environmental mold based on a visual assessment. Well, all mold is environmental mold. Molds are created in the lab, right? And it's always caused by water or transfer of mold spores from some other area, right? So there is mold in the environment outdoors, but really the scientific testing, the only thing that can tell you is the genera of mold different to what it is outdoors. And that allows you to understand, okay, well, no, something else has caused the mold inside.
That's right. And if a provider, a restorer, builder, if anyone's using terminology, event-related mold, what they're actually doing is making a policy decision, because they're saying, oh, the event is defined in the policy. This mold is not related to that. That's outside their area of expertise. They shouldn't be commenting on that. If they were to comment on anything, it should be, well, how's the water got in here? How's the mold developed over a period of time? And doing the testing to confirm what type of mold it is. So as soon as they're saying those things, red flag, you need to be seeking a second opinion or going into the complaints process.
The thing on that point as well, it's not always what they say to you on site. We often hear that what claimant gets told on site by the providers is all very positive, as if it's going to be accepted as a claim, and then subsequently the claim gets declined, right? And it's not till 3-4 months later they receive those reports when they're disputing that decision, and they see that provider that told them, oh, this should be accepted, it's all caused by that event, has written down, oh, it's all environmental mold, not caused by the event. And that's triggered that. So that's really an important point as well, as any person who attends your property will be doing a report, and you should be requesting that report. And if anything kind of differs from what you were told on site, you should be raising that with the insurer.
Yeah. It comes back to that point around documenting conversations, documenting what you've been told on site, so that if you do need to rely on it later on, you can. We've covered off some of these points already, but if we're talking about why a claim that involves mold is so complex, do you want to talk through some of those reasons that they do become complex over time?
Yeah, it is a whole range of reasons, and we've kind of touched on even the complexities in the standards themselves and what's required to be done in those initial stages. So I want to touch on that, but I think as well, there's very differing views across the entire industry about what is required. The standards themselves, there are multiple different types of standards that different providers follow and different companies rely on. It's not like a builder, right, who has the building code. Everyone has to comply with the building code. It's legislated, it's required, right? In the mold industry, there's multiple standards, and they do allow a lot of room for subjective interpretation in the best way to fix that problem. That kind of variance in approach often creates issues. There's also multiple different types of remediators and things like that. So there's what people call IEPs, indoor environmental professionals, there's occupational hygienists, there's building scientists, there's remediators themselves who do the work. So there's varying different views across those professionals around what's required. And then because mold is everywhere, to some extent, it does become an easy option to say, well, no, mold is everywhere. That's not caused by the event. And then doing the testing and things like that is not something that's normally done. So the testing will confirm if the mold in that environment, the types and species of that mold are water-based molds and therefore likely related to that event, compared to the molds that you see in the outdoor reference that they take as well. So it's got a lot of failure points in a mold claim. And then on top of that, the fact it spreads. Again, it's not like any other insurance claim. It gets worse. Some of the worst species of mold, your Stachybotrys, your Chaetomium, those types of molds are really related to water damage and water-based kind of growth, but even more so for kind of long-term growth, right? So if they're sitting in a wall for an extended period, it hasn't been stripped, it starts to get moldy, those molds and species start to grow because it's been sitting there for a really long time. And then on top of that, they make you sick. Unfortunately, that then starts to, we've seen it time and time again when someone starts to get material mental deterioration as a result of that, which then adds further complexity, not just now dealing with a claim in your home, you may be sick. Your kids might be sick. You may not be able to live in your home. You might be living outside of your home. So it's kind of this compounding factor of all these things that then makes it really difficult. It's probably the reason we see so many claims related to water, being around for 12 months, 24 months, 3 years. We've seen some for 8 or 9 years, right? And it just keeps getting worse and worse.
So I think you touched on a couple of good points there. I mean, the first one is around qualifications and the fact that it varies greatly between those providers that you mentioned. And the insurer will say we're sending out a hygienist, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily sending out an occupational hygienist, which you might assume, which is someone with at least a 4-year university degree and some baseline level of qualification and expertise. They'll say they're sending out an indoor environmental professional. The reality of that is it's a short course to become an indoor environmental professional. And then after that, people can have a lot of expertise and experience in different areas, which can make them a really good IEP. But having that title alone doesn't mean that they're sending someone who is highly trained in that area. And that's not to discredit that qualification. It's just to say to people that you just need to make sure that you're really comfortable in what you're being told and looking to make sure that they're actually doing the things that would show that they're highly skilled in that, which is doing things like scientific testing, moisture mapping. They're looking at the cause. They're really trying to understand what's going on. If they're coming in and saying environmental mold, or they're saying non-event related mold, you might as well ask them to leave and get someone else, because that shows that they're reckless and they're not taking it seriously. And then when it comes to restorers, it's the same thing, right? Like, to become a restorer, there's certain things you need to do, but it means that the barrier to entry is reasonably low. And there are some really great restorers out there, and there are probably some that are newer to the industry, and the level of expertise and the service that you get varies between them. So all it means is that you need to be on high alert, and you need to be educated in terms of what needs to happen after these events. I was also going to say that there is a real disconnect at times between the IICRC standards that they refer to around what you should do for mold and water damage and the insurance policy itself. And we spoke about one earlier around habitable areas. I think sometimes there is a lack of training for these providers around what they should comment on and what they shouldn't comment on. And they should be limiting what they're saying about the standards, about how the mold has developed in their opinion. And the reality is it shouldn't be a definitive thing, because often there might be multiple factors that are going on, but it should be balanced. And then after that point, the insurer should be considering, does the policy respond? So if they're saying it's event related, they're trying to do a policy decision, and that's not appropriate. So just make sure they're commenting on things within their area of expertise. We see plenty of IEPs that go out there and want to talk about building, and they want to talk about gutters, and they want to talk like all of that stuff. Unless they have qualifications in that, they really shouldn't be putting that in an expert report, which they're saying is independent and that the insurer is then going to rely on, because it can result in declined claims. The final one that I think happens all the time, unfortunately, is what we touched on earlier. You have providers go out early on and they make mistakes. They don't do what they should have done. Sometimes it's not their fault. They don't have delegation. The insurer didn't approve what they needed to do at that point. But after 12 months and the claim has now become significantly worse, the costs blow out. Sometimes insurers can look to recover those increased costs from the providers. So when they are going out, naturally, you do start to see where they might be trying to downplay how bad the mold is, because they want to downplay the cost of it. Or insurers getting to cost mitigation, where they're like, okay, this has become really bad. That's where they start. You see the red flag of like panicking and sending out lots of different experts. Suddenly we want engineers and IEPs and hygienists, and they're trying to stack the evidence because they know that it's going to be a significant claim, that it's going to cost a lot. But the problem that we see is that often that just results in lots of different opinions. You've got often engineers commenting on mold they shouldn't, or builders commenting on mold, or all these experts commenting on things they shouldn't. And it becomes highly complex. And then for a consumer, you end up with 5 reports that are adverse to you and your position around the claim. And to your point, you can do a blood test, you can find mold in your blood, you're concerned about your family's health, and you have an insurer that's now trying to decline your claim. And that is a highly stressful place to find yourself. And you also need to be able to get the experts in to counter that evidence.
Again, it's really tough. Like all those points you touch on, they're all quite complex and hard for a consumer to remember, and that it is timely. Again, I'd stress that, that hard work early pays off later. If you start to see things that don't add up, you know what they always say, if there's smoke, there's fire. If there's smell, there's likely mold and a failed insurance claim response from the restorers and their providers, right? So start to call those things out, be really diligent, try and educate yourself, be involved in the process, and hopefully it doesn't really happen to yourselves.
All right, so assuming people have had a claim, some issues are starting to arise, going to make a complaint, what are some of the tips that you would give them around making a complaint initially, and then maybe also some tips if you were going to go to AFCA?
What we're seeing very often in the process is that people will complain, right? Now, per the RG 271, the regulatory guide, that is a formal complaint and requires a response from the internal dispute resolution team. Often it doesn't. Right? So typically what we see is the claims manager will try and resolve it. In reality, though, that commitment needs to come to fruition and needs to be delivered in the way that they thought it would to actually allow that complaint to be resolved. Effectively raising a complaint and, getting the outcome you want to achieve through that. It's similar advice to what we said before. It's actually based on what you would have collected earlier in the claim, right? So if you're keeping really detailed documentation around what's happened during the claim, what's gone wrong, that's the information you need to then rely on in regards to that complaint. So make the items that you're complaining about really specific, i.e. the issues in dispute, and then refer to that evidence you've collected during the claim and relay that back to them. Don't expect they will find it. Make it easy for that person reviewing the complaint to understand the claim, understand your position, understand why you should ultimately be found in favour. We'd love to see all complaints get resolved at that internal level within the insurer. Unfortunately, we don't. I think there's quite a high rate of claims or complaints that get maintained within insurance companies at the moment.
So I think just to be clear to people, there's internal dispute resolution, or what the insurer might call like a level 1 complaint. So it's when you first do that expression of dissatisfaction. That's considered a level 1. They send that to their internal dispute resolution team. They will then do a final decision on that complaint. And then you have an option to take it to AFCA. I think what you're saying is that the IDR team, we've heard some insurers actually have targets on how many they need to maintain in that process. So it's probably not surprising that sometimes the insurer is doubling down on their decision or they're maintaining their decision in the claim. So don't take that. You should be escalating to AFCA, which is the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. You can lodge a complaint online. It's free for consumers. It does cost the insurer to go through that process, and the decisions are binding on the insurer. Not necessarily on a consumer. They could still take it further to court if they wanted to. So don't take the IDR outcome and go, oh, I couldn't be bothered challenging this anymore. They're just going to maintain their decision. AFCA is that independent body that can make a determination. They're impartial in that complaint. So make sure that you do challenge it. And if you've gone to the effort of complaining, it's not that much more effort to go to AFCA, and you'll get the assistance of an independent person to have a look at it.
And I think while that internal process that you described does probably find in favour of the insurer rather than the insured a lot, it doesn't mean you should kind of brush over it and not try in regards to, provided the evidence and all those type of things. If you think about that process, there's a claims manager involved. You have a complaint maybe about their conduct or one of their suppliers or a decision they've made on that claim. When you lodge that complaint, it goes to that independent team. Now, that independent team, they're solely just reviewing and making complaint determinations, right? They're probably making 2 a day. They probably have a short period of time where they're reviewing the evidence and the information to make that decision. So if you can make it as easy as possible to them to see what your problem is and the evidence that supports that, there is a chance that it'll get overturned at that point, or they'll support your finding. And we always find that is the easiest way to get it done. It's the quickest. But yeah, as you said, if you don't get it done there, does go to that AFCA process. And again, it's all about documentation, referencing the evidence, making sure your points are really clear and easily understood by an independent party.
I think that's the point. These internal dispute resolution teams are overrun with complaints. If you're receiving the complaint outcome on the final day, it's likely they picked it up on the final day before it was due. You've got 30 calendar days for them to give their response. And if they don't, they should be advising you that they need longer. But a lot of the time, the complaint response is being provided on the 30th day. And the reality for that person is that their internal metrics is that they respond on the 30th day, and it means that they probably haven't given it the time or attention that it needs. Now, that's not just a criticism of an insurer. It means that for customers, you need to be really clear and really explicit in what you're wanting. What outcome are you wanting? What evidence do you have? You need to think about someone who knows nothing about your claim and walk them through it so that when they read it and they look at all the evidence, they can go, right, John wants independent assessment, or they want the insurer, John wants the insurer to fund an independent mould report, and here's a quote for $2,000. You're far more likely to potentially get that than where you're not clear in your complaint email. It's not clear that you want an independent person, and that complaint person's probably picking it up, completely overworked. It's a lot easier for them to just maintain the decision at that point and probably do the right thing. And for that, I think that one of the outcomes that's really common when people complain, and something to be just mindful of, that a lot of the time when you first complain about mold, they want to resolve the complaint by saying, we'll send out an IEP, or we'll send out a hygienist. Does that resolve your complaint? And if it's about the fact that there's mold contamination, there's a problem, what you should be saying to them is, no, it doesn't resolve my complaint. And if you do allow that assessment to occur, that you want your complaint to remain open until they accept that the mold is related, or that they do the remediation to the standard that you're happy with. Because often, unfortunately, that report that comes back is unfavourable to the customer. So they've resolved your complaint on the basis that they've appointed this independent party who has a contract with the insurer, of which you're not entitled to, that they've got, they're being paid by the insurer, a whole heap of things that you're unaware of. They're not independent, just for any industry people watching, happy to debate that anytime. Doesn't mean that they're not being impartial, but they're not independent from the insurer. So they're sending out someone that's on a panel or on a panel of their builder, and they have contractual, most of the time, relationships with that insurer. And that's not to say that their opinion is always wrong. It just means that you need to make sure that you're also giving that expert the right evidence, that you're making sure they look at the right things, that you're getting them to do that scientific testing when they come on site. And, part of that, for example, might be that your complaint outcome is that you want scientific testing done by an independent lab. So if a provider's coming out and doing the testing, you want that to be looked at by an independent lab, and that's part of your complaint outcome. But not being clear on that means that you're highly unlikely to get it. And what it does mean is that you're likely going to have another expert come out. It's going to take another month. You're going to get the report. You're going to be unhappy with it. Then you've got a bigger complaint than what you had at the start. So just be really clear on what you're trying to get out of it when you lodge that complaint. And I get it I feel for consumers, because it's not like we all get taught about mold or insurance claims, and when IDR come into it, it suddenly gets technical and they're talking about this pursuant to this obligation to policy and we don't cover mold. And it's the first time all of that's thrown in the consumer's face. It's very overwhelming at that point. And that's why they need to also start to think about getting their own independent evidence themselves, or asking the insurer to fund that, because finding someone who can do a report for you that you know and trust, or that you can look up on reviews online to be able to do that testing and do a report for you, at least you know that it's independent of the insurer, and that you get a really good understanding of what needs to happen at your property. But you really just need to do your research about who you're getting. And then you can ask the insurer to fund it. They often say no. They'll often say things like, if it changes our opinion, we'll pay for the report. But these reports, like independent mold reports, might be $3,000 with testing. That's a lot of money for a consumer to take on, and there's no guarantees it's necessarily going to be favourable in that. And I think, unfortunately, for the industry, they do play on that a little bit. They know that consumers can't fund that, particularly if they're then stuck in with an engineer that might be $5,000, or your occupational hygienist might be $5,000. For a consumer, you find yourself up against it from an evidence perspective, but you do need that evidence, particularly if you go to AFCA, because if you go to AFCA, and even though what you're saying might be objectively true, it might be based on all the facts, all the photos, AFCA does place a lot of weight on experts. And therefore, if the insurer has reports that are unfavourable to you, you should be trying to get your own reports and working with AFCA if you're in the AFCA process to try and get them to work with the insurer to fund that report. But if you can't get that, you really do need to think about a way to get that evidence, because otherwise you risk losing just because an expert hasn't been able to side with your view of what's going on. Because I find with AFCA, you put the right evidence in front of them, they will weigh it up between the two of them and then hopefully come to the right answer. But if they only have one side's evidence, and your opinion, no matter how good it might be, it's likely that they may find against you in that process. Otherwise, there's plenty of examples where they haven't done that. The same goes with a building quote or a restoration quote. You need the evidence to support what you're claiming the insurer needs to pay you in that process.
It's not enough to just say it should be accepted, or that building quote is too low. You need the evidence there. I can understand it from AFCA's perspective. They perceive that the insurer and the insured are conflicted in the process, right? So they need to rely on expert reports. Unfortunately, too often we do see people going to AFCA with a complaint where it's purely based on their opinion and views. Now, they may be right. They don't have the evidence to say it from an expert. The one advantage a consumer does have, though, against the insurer is that they know what it was like prior to the event. They might have access to photos that they can reference. If they've taken those steps we've spoken about earlier around clearly documenting not just what's damaged, but what's not damaged at the time of the event, given that mold can spread, they can leverage those photos, and insurer can't, right? They only have those reports they have. They don't have that data that you can rely on. So again, it does come back to that early intervention on your claim, really owning it, being involved in it, documenting everything can really help later on if it does go off the rails and need to go through that complaints process.
Yeah, and at the risk of getting technical from an onus perspective around, if you are someone and you have an insurance claim, you have an onus to basically establish that an event occurred. Often that's accepted, right? Like a storm's happened, someone's come out afterwards, they accept a storm has happened. Sometimes it's actually difficult to identify which storm did it. So that can be quite challenging, but for a consumer, you need to establish that the event occurred and that damage was sustained as a result of that event. So most of the time, what we're talking about is that you have water come in, goes into a certain location, mold is then growing in that specific location. You need to be able to point that out to show to AFCA that, look, we've established that that has occurred. The onus from an insurer's perspective, if they're seeking to rely on an exclusion right, which is what they're often doing at this point, they're trying to say that's pre-existing, that's not event-related mold, that's environmental mold. What they have to do is actually establish that without assumptions. So they have to prove that it's pre-existing. They have to establish that that mold is environmental. And often they don't do that. They just might be an expert going in there. They may have a great title, but they're just then making assumptions. As soon as they say that's environmental mold, that's an assumption. You haven't proven that that's environmental mold and not related to the event. So for consumers, when you're looking at these reports and you're trying to highlight to AFCA why that report shouldn't be accepted, it's important as much as possible to put your emotions to the side. Like, you're angry about it. Often people feel betrayed by these experts because they're very friendly to you in person. They might be chatting, and then suddenly little comments you make are turning up in a report being used against you. But try to put the emotions to one side and just be really practical about the fact of, have they proven that exclusion that they seek to rely on? And if they haven't proven it, think about how you could show AFCA that that narrative that they're saying is not true, and therefore the assumption they're making is just an overly favourable one to the insurer. And what you said is a good point. If they're saying it's pre-existing, here's a photo AFCA I took 1 month before, and people forget, like, we know you're not walking around taking videos of your house, even though I think you should, right? But we know you're not. But what you might be doing is taking a video of your kid cutting a birthday cake. And in the background of that is the area that's damaged. And that's the photos and things that you could look to rely on at a later point to go, no, see, but like the area that you're saying had environmental mold, here it is 1 month before the event, and it's not covered in mold. And the other thing is to remember that it is the insurer's onus to prove the exclusion, not the customers to disprove the exclusion. Because we see it all the time where the insurer basically goes, oh, well, you have to prove it's not pre-existing. Technically, that's not true, but if you can, brilliant, right? So if you have the photos and you can show that. If not, get statements from you, get statements from your partner, get statements from a friend that had come over to your house and they're saying there's no mold. Now, the insurer will say to you, oh, that's not evidence. We can't, the policy says you can't rely on that. That's all rubbish, right? Because AFCA can look at that. They can look at what's fair and reasonable in that circumstance. So think about the things that are in your control that you could get to show it. But what I would say is when you're getting into that process, no matter how much a complaint person says, I'm independent, I'm in a different team, they work for the insurer. And they're there to advocate for the insurer's position. Don't necessarily take what they're saying and go, oh, well, if you said that I can't do a statement and that's not evidence, I'm not going to go get a statement. Get the statement, get the photos, put it together, do it in a way to make it easy for a AFCA person to read, and you're light years ahead. Unfortunately, we see it all the time where people might come to us and it's got way too complicated, right? There's 7 different experts, there's 1,000 emails, there's 100 documents. You're then trying to get AFCA to find in your favor, and it's just got so messy. Often not at the fault of the customer. It can also be that the insurers their favorite thing is a reassessment or another report or another expert, or, when something gets complicated, it's an engineer, and there's no thought from them about, is that actually required and will that help resolve the complaint? So if you're finding the insurer is not doing the right thing, getting that complaint in early and going to AFCA is a good idea, rather than necessarily allowing 15 different assessments and letting it get very complicated at that point. And that's not to say you don't allow assessments, it's just that insurers are entitled to reasonable assessments and they have to outline why it's required. And if they've already declined it and they've already said, no, we're not paying that, sending someone out again to stack the evidence is also not appropriate. So going to AFCA at that point and trying to get someone independent to get involved and overturn the decision is a lot easier early on than 3 years later, because there's a lot of material often at that point.
Yeah, I've almost never seen when let's just say there's a decision to decline a claim based on an engineer's report. There's a complaint about that decision. The IDR person offers another engineer to go out. I've almost never seen that engineer changing the decision. You have to remember, one, the complaints person is conflicted because they work for the insurance company. So they're probably recommending something that's going to get you to agree to it, but also that's going to benefit the insurance company. And then on top of that, that engineer, if he goes against that decision, he's kind of almost going against his client. I think very rarely you see them change a position when there's a position already on the claim. Now, it doesn't never happen, but just always be kind of skeptical around what they're suggesting and why, and ultimately what you're trying to achieve and the best way to get there.
Yeah, it shouldn't be the case that when they're going to appoint someone, do your research. Go online. Like, a lot of these providers don't have reviews. That's a red flag. If you're not allowing reviews on you on Google or something else, it probably means that you're worried that you're going to get a lot of adverse reviews in that. Look at the ownership. Like, there's a notable loss adjuster who owns the engineering firm that they appoint as independent with a different name, but it's the exact same ABN as the loss adjuster. And if the insurer or the loss adjuster or someone else is trying to say that, we're going to appoint someone independent, make sure they're independent. If they've already been involved in the claim and, they're partly related to what's going on, well, they can't then provide an independent view on it, even if they're a different person within that company. Because if you do get someone independent, I have seen decisions be overturned in that process, but trying to use the same ones, I've never really seen it change too much. And to your point with an engineer, I've seen one favourable engineering report in all the ones I've seen for consumers. So also, don't just take because someone has high qualifications as gospel, because the reality is they can still get it wrong. There still can be lots of opinions, and if you're looking through it and you can see that every assumption is favourable to the insurer, that's what you call out. And it's to do it in a way that's not emotional, that they're biased and they're clearly just trying to save the insurer. It's going, well, they're making this assumption here which is favourable to the insurer whilst overlooking this assumption that could also be favourable towards us. So saying, I assume it's environmental mould, well then the other assumption is that it's related to the event, and they're not going down that path. So just be really mindful of that stuff, but try to stay factual throughout. It's really hard. A lot of the time, as we see, people come to us with legitimate mental health conditions because they've been gaslit from people for months, where they're saying the right thing to the insurer and they're saying the complete opposite, and then that really impacts their mental health. I think sometimes it is professional gaslighting. Then when they come to us and we say, look, the point you're making is valid and what you're saying is correct, and they'll cry on the phone, it can kind of just show the mental strain that this complaints process can have. And then to think that you've got to get expert reports and you've got to write complaint submissions. This is the one where I think that it's okay sometimes to put your hand up and say, I actually need some help here. And AFCA goes a long way to help close that gap, but there are some things that you just need to do. And not that this is intended ever to be a promotion for Claims Hero, but there are other free services available as well that at times if you are feeling so overwhelmed that you feel like it's stacked against you or that it's too technical, that's the time to look for help. Either from a legal aid in your particular state, or if it's from Claims Hero, or we obviously have a Facebook group around complaints that people can join. The link will be in the bio of the video, but it's getting that support from others. That's when it's really critical. And the AFCA person is meant to be impartial. So sometimes people can also feel like the case manager at AFCA is not on my side. And by design, they're not meant to be fair. They're meant to act impartially. But if you need some support, reach out. There's never been more resources available to consumers. Become educated around mould. There are different types. There are types of mould that's related to water, and what that means is it needs a water source and a food source to grow. So if you're saying it's environmental and there's a water-based mould there, the question is really well, how did that water get into the property in the first place to then create mould? If they're saying it's humidity-based mould, there's a real science behind how the humidity has to be at a certain level for a certain amount of days until it creates enough condensation to be the water source for mould. And the reality is in most cities or towns, the humidity isn't high enough for an extended period of time to get that level. Well, the insurers have created an environment that was temporarily really high humid by going, shut your house up, turn the aircon off and leave it like that until we do our assessment. And they come in and then they go, oh, gotcha, humidity is so high, no wonder mould's growing. But we'll normally have the windows open and you have an aircon on. And it's really understanding the science will help you show to AFCA or to someone else that the opinion that they're relying on is not correct. But it is hard. And that's why these are complex. And kind of being frank with people, it is one of these ones where you're going to end up with so many opinions that are night and day. And I didn't expect to see this. Right, my background was in personal injury. I mean, very rarely you see something so black and white, and two people arguing for complete opposites. It's not, there's mould and we're arguing over where the mould's, how bad it is and what needs to happen. Sometimes it's whether mould's there or not that you're arguing about. So it is very stressful to find yourself in that situation. So think about help, talk to AFCA if you're in that process, and do the research are kind of key tips in that process. And just whatever you do, it's not to say that insurers are bad and they're trying to do this stuff, but don't just trust it. Don't just say, yes, okay, if you're saying that, it must be true, therefore I'm just going to drop my complaint. Because there's plenty of AFCA determinations, and they're published on AFCA's website. You can look up the determinations where if it's found in favour of the consumer, and right up until the determination, the insurer was maintaining that they're not liable for it, and then AFCA finds that they are liable for the mould. And sometimes what we see is that they're actually liable for it outside of the policy terms because the insurer's conduct contributed to the mould getting so bad. So it's a really good lesson that if you're not happy with what the insurer is offering, it doesn't cost you anything to go through that AFCA process. If you feel like you get a reasonable argument, challenge the insurer and go through it, because it can be a real difference in what you get, and it could be the difference between your family having a safe place to live and the money to be able to remediate it properly so that it's back to a normal mold ecology, or where you're having to borrow money, or you're going to have to try and just live in an environment that's not safe for your family, which is not ideal. So it's really important that people find a way to challenge the insurers through that process.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like hearing you talk about support before, and I think there's a broader spectrum of support available to anyone in a claim. They kind of got to understand what's the thing that's impacting them the most, right? Because we've spoken and we've touched on expert reports. If they're comfortable with managing the claim, they're not overly stressed, then it's obtaining the expert evidence to support you, right? If they're highly emotional and their claim itself has impacted their mental well-being, it might be seeing a psychologist or some sort of mental support, right? That helps clear that up and allows them then to focus on those key issues. They might be sick from the mold, right? And then it's another health professional to kind of relieve that pain point so they can manage the claim, right? And as you said, then it's kind of, if you're struggling with the insurance claim itself, what to do, understanding onus, obligations, all that type of stuff. And maybe it is an advocate or a legal support or something like that. But kind of someone stepping back and thinking about what's my biggest blind spot or issue within this claim, what's driving, the challenges I'm having with it, other than obviously others' intervention, like the insurer or potentially their providers. That's really important to kind of assess and then work out what support's best for you.
I think it's an important one. How often do we hear it's like, my marriage is breaking up, or, I've been a horrible mother, or I've been a horrible father, or all this stuff. And it's like, what is important when you're going through this stuff is also that you focus on your family and that that's what's important. A lot of the time it's really disruptive, right? If you're living in an alternative accommodation that's not suitable, that puts a lot of stress on it. Kids really like to be in the same environment. They don't like change. So that can stir a family up massively. So then to have a parent that is absent because they're trying to find an insurer, which all credit to them, right? Like a lot of the clients that find us have searched the internet and they've shown a lot of determination to get to that point. But the reality is sometimes you actually just need that time back so you can focus on your family and have the claim managed through that process. So yeah, it's not intended to be a plug, but there really is, to your point, if you step back and that's what you need, then there's certain avenues you need to look at. I was just going to say, what's a claim that you've managed that's come to us? What's one that sort of comes to mind around mold?
It's not one we've managed, it's my own claim. I've been through the process myself. I had a small amount of water ingress from the 2022 floods in Brisbane. It came through my roof. We were actually in the hospital at that time, or having my daughter. So we're out of the home for about 5 days, came back, saw some staining on our bedroom ceiling. The insurer came through, said, it can be painted. And, they say that painters always have the worst painted house. Well, I had the worst managed claim, right? I accepted that at that point in time, probably knowing...
Pre-claim zero, what you get?
Pre-claim zero, but still working for an insurer.
Yeah.
And never really thought about what the impact of that might be. You fast track 2 years and my house is full of mold. My children are getting rashes. I'm getting rashes. There's some probably behavioral problems driven by that mold. We're living in it. I'm cleaning mold off walls every few weeks. My hands are red raw from the different cleaning products they have available. And that claim, it took about, from that point, once I realized, and my wife said, you need to go back to the insurer here and push me to do it. It took about a year to resolve. It was a huge impact on my family.
It was quite difficult. So long afterwards, you've got to then prove that the mold was related to that 2022 event. But we do have that a bit, right? Where you're reopening a claim because you're looking at it and going, well, particularly with the knowledge of standards and what should have happened, it's like, well, painting over that was never the right decision. So as soon as you've done that, you've left that environment where it can grow. And then often, wall cavities, everything else, once you start searching for it, you can kind of find out where the mold has spread. And it's a good one often that you need to keep testing until you work out how far that mold has spread. Yes, what can start in a small area, as you test the wall cavities and you move away from that area, you can kind of see that maybe over time, or it was a more widespread impact if it was spoken previously.
Well, I think for me, it was what actually, the only reason we were able to reopen that and link it back to that event is because I took a lot of photos. And it wasn't as I went back and started looking at the photos, I was seeing different parts that were damaged, right? Clearly needed to be removed. And that was ultimately the source of the microbial growth. And then once experts looked at that, they were kind of able to validate and go, well, yeah, what happened shouldn't have happened. And then this is how it has spread, right? They could tell that narrative based on science, based on testing, all those things. But again, I've kind of lived that emotional impact, right? And it's more so your family.
It's if your kids, your partner, they're uncertain, you're focusing more on trying to get that result. So yeah, that's been a big claim for me. I guess one from Claims Hero would probably be the first person who ever cried to me on the phone. I feel now today, it's a lot of people cry because they feel more comfortable with us, opening up with us. The first person who, they were very kind of strong throughout the process, never showed any really emotion. They're obviously frustrated and angry, but never really broke down. I didn't really see that vulnerability. And then once we resolved that claim, and they were kind of going from either having their claim completely declined with no money, right, and a home that's ruined, so having enough money to repair their home, get their family back in there, paying for temporary accommodation, really changing their life. And when they cried to me on the phone, it really made me realize, the kind of impact to people, but as well the value that we can add through that process. So I think they'll always stick with me and probably be one of the proudest moments I've had in a professional career, really.
I think there's a bit of that guilt at times, but like when you realize that, I should have told the insurer, I should have got them to do it. Like now I've had my family live in a mouldy home, and what has that done? And yeah, I think that's why we advocate a lot, and we do a lot around education and try and say to people, like, if you've had water come in your home, please just do these things straight away. Like one day you might end up with a big cash payment, or you might get your house fully repaired, but anyone who's had one of these claims would say it's not worth it, because there's so much stress and anxiety through that whole period, where there's inevitably some periods of where you don't know whether that's going to be covered or not, or whether you're going to have a safe home to go back to. So I think that's really important to remember as you go through that, is that you don't know any better. You should have been told at the time. You're relying on these certain providers to do this stuff, so don't take on too much guilt in that process, and hold the people accountable who should have known better at the time. It's a very good segue into wrap it up. A message to the industry, what would you say around mold claims based on what we've seen?
Early intervention. I think they can all be avoided. There should be no mold claims. Every water damage claim has the potential to turn into a mold claim, and that can be devastating for people's homes, but as well their health, their family, their well-being. It can really ruin their lives. If immediate action is taken to dry the property out, to remove contaminated materials, this should never happen. So that'd be my one message.
Mine would probably be, I'm struggling not to say it in a grumpy way, but cut this bullshit about, the expert said that, so it must be true. Do some bloody research. Like, it's not that hard. Like, this mold stuff is science. It's backed by what you should and shouldn't do. Just because you pay someone to do a report doesn't mean that you can't then go and do a bit of independent research. Because so often when we look at it, 6 months later, the error was so obvious in the report, or the conclusion was so flawed at the time, that had you have just done the smallest bit of research into what the customer was saying, you would overturn the claim immediately. And it's actually frustrating sometimes when we get involved and they do overturn it immediately, because we say it, but the customer's been saying it for a long time. So I think it's like, when it comes to mold claims, the impacts of mold claims, there is plenty of information out there, and the industry, not the restoration, not the mold, not that, the claims teams should go and do some information about it. Because I think when you actually look into it, you'll be quite concerned about some of the conduct that you've done to consumers. And I think for the industry, it's like, if you don't fix it, it may very well turn into be one of the biggest remediation programs they'll ever have to do around the claims that they have not managed properly. So the ex-risk and compliance nerd in me says, draw a line in the sand and start doing it properly. Otherwise, that is potentially just getting bigger over time. All right, I think we've covered a fair bit there. Thank you for that.
Well, no worry. And look, a great man did once say, where there's smoke, there's fire. Where there's a smell, there's a mold remediation program on the horizon. So thanks for having me, Luke.
All right, well, maybe we'll get that as a tattoo or something. We'll put some links down below to some of those resources around mold, where you can go, the Facebook group, how to make an AFCA complaint. But yeah, we also have blogs on our website for around mold, and do your research. Challenge these insurers, and early intervention, both from the insurer and the customer, will avoid a lot of the nightmares that happen later on. Do you have a saying for that, or are we done?
Oh, I'd face out, so no.
We're done.
Thanks, Luke.